Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Vivian Guevara, Training and Technical Assistance Program Coordinator at Housing Action Illinois. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be available for download in our website. We will walk you through the steps on how to fill out and provide supporting documentation for the FPP4 grant quarterly reports. And also, we will discuss the strategies for successful grant writing and best practices when applying for funds from IDA. For SPPG organizations, we will put a separate reporting webinar in our website. Our presenter today is David Young, Director of Technical Assistance in Housing Action. If you have any questions, please write your question in the window, and I will be sure that our panelists answer it during the presentation. Okay, let's start. David?
Good morning, everyone. This is David Young with Housing Action Illinois. Thank you for joining us. And as Vivian said, we are going to do two webinars this morning, one regarding the FPP4 quarterly reporting, and the second one regarding grant writing. For those of you who have also received FPPG funds, we will do a separate webinar on FPPG, which will be posted directly to our website. So that will be available to you going in the near future. So let's get started. Again, thanks for joining us. Most of you know about Housing Action Illinois and what we do. And so our agenda today is to understand the FPP4 counseling and education reporting process and how reporting the expenses correctly will benefit your organization. As I'm sure many of you experienced when you submitted your first quarterly report during the summer, it might have been rejected for missing items. And so we felt that this was a good opportunity for us to go over those things that are needed for this report, make sure that everyone is clear, give people an opportunity to answer questions, or ask questions, I should say, and we would answer those questions. And then also have this information available online so that going forward, if there are any issues, if IDA comes back to you, for example, and says that your quarterly report is incorrect, you have the ability of going back and listening to this report or listening to this webinar again and making sure that all the things that are called for in the webinar that you're doing is a part of your reporting. So you want to make sure some of these things will be pretty obvious, but we are going to talk about them anyway because it's important to do so. There is a disbursement statement that each FPP4 grantee has received, and you want to make sure that you are including that statement with your quarterly submission because that explains what it is that you are actually asking for in each one of the categories. So, step by step, when you are filling out your quarterly report, one, you want to make sure that you have actually spent the money that you would like to have reimbursed. So, for example, if you say that you are going to buy a computer, you want to make sure that that computer that was purchased was during the quarter for which you are reporting. If it happened in a previous quarter or in a future quarter, you can't include that. So you want to make sure that that purchase was actually made in the quarter that you're reporting on. You want to provide proof of payment, a copy of the check, and an invoice. So, for example, if you did buy a computer, you should have an invoice from the computer seller, and then you should also have a check showing that you paid the computer seller for that hardware. So you want to make sure that you include both the invoice as well as the computer or as well as the check from your organization, as that shows IDA that has been paid. You also want to make sure that you list all of the activities that you performed. And you want to make sure that those are the activities that took place during that particular quarter. So not during quarters either before or after, but during that particular quarter. If you are including payroll for staff, which I'm sure most of you are, then you want to make sure that you are including your payroll journals that show that all of the staff that are being included in your FPP budget have been compensated for that period. Because the worst thing for an organization to do would be to charge FPP4 for employee expenses, but then not be able to document that those expenses were actually paid. Again, as we talked about in step 3, when you are documenting payroll, you want to make sure that it is for that particular quarter. I think some of us all ran into a little bit of an issue earlier because originally I think with this grant was expected to start April 1st and then it started a little bit later, I believe April 17th. And so that meant that payroll that took place during those first 2 weeks of April, you couldn't include. And I think some of us, Housing Action included, did actually submit that and those got rejected. So you want to make sure that the payroll that you're including is for the quarter and that those are in the right quarterly dates. And stay within your established budget. If you have put, for example, $25,000 in salaries and benefits, then you want to make sure that through the end of the program that you've only spent that amount. If you believe that you're going to change that amount, if you're going to go over or you're going to be under, then you want to make sure that you are in touch with IDA so that you can revise your budget prior to the end of the contract. So, for example, if you, after the first quarter report, realize that you're going to need more dollars for payroll or more dollars for technical expenses, then you want to make sure that you are reaching out to IDA now and making those revisions to your budget and getting permission to do that. Don't wait until the last minute. So each organization has the sample foreclosure prevention program R4 counseling and education disbursement statement. If you look at the top of the statement, and hopefully you can see my cursor here, when you insert your agency name in that drop-down box, your project number should automatically come up. You also want to make sure that you are including your contact person, and then in the time period drop-down box, making sure that you are clicking on the correct quarter. For your expenses should align with what you put in your initial budget, and it is quite possible that not all of you used all of these categories. You might have used some of them. If you did use all of them, then you want to make sure that you're putting information in there for that particular quarter. Your quarterly financial and data reports are due on these particular dates. In the expense category, you want to make sure that you are showing the expenses that align with the category. So with column 1, if you have personnel and salaries, then you're going to be putting some numbers in column 2 to show a detail. If you are doing equipment rental, you'll be doing the same thing. In column 2, so for example, if you do have personnel and salary expenses, then you would be putting how much your personnel costs were for the current quarter in column 3. And let me just step back just a little bit. So for column 1, it's the expense category. For column 2, it's the detail. So in column 2, for example, you would indicate salary for housing counselor or salary for housing counselor and program manager. If it's general operational and you are maybe using some of your FPP funds towards rent or towards utilities, then you would indicate in that line the funds for rent or funds for your utility bills. In column 3, you're going to indicate the current quarter costs for each one of those categories. So if you spent $6,000 in personnel and salaries for the current quarter, then you want to make sure that you're including that in column 3, in column 3. And then you want to indicate your cumulative costs for all of the quarters. So if this quarter is, let's say that this is, you're submitting your second quarterly report, which is due early in October, then you would, in the cumulative cost column, you would total what you have expended in the current quarter with what you expended in the previous quarter to show what has been spent in the grant thus far. So your cumulative is always going to change depending on what quarter you are in. Do not forget to sign and date the quarterly report. If you do not sign and date it, then IDA's going to kick it back. Also note, if IDA does return a report to you and you need to redo it, change the date on the report so that IDA can quickly be able to tell the difference between the old report and the new report. That will just help them. So don't forget to include the canceled check with each of your invoices to show proof of payment. You can scan that information in, you can make a copy and then create a package, but you want to make sure that all of those things are legible and easy to read. The more that IDA has to try and decipher things, the harder it's going to be or the longer it's going to take for you to get your reimbursement. So you again want to make sure that you are including a canceled check and that you are including the invoice. So as we talked about with the example earlier, if you purchase a computer, you want to make sure that you are showing the invoice for the computer and the check that pays the vendor. That way IDA knows for sure that you have actually ordered the equipment and that you've paid for the equipment. So double check, make sure that all of the checks and invoices are included in the correct category. And we're going to show you in just a minute a cover sheet that you can use to help to break out the different categories, which should make it much easier for IDA to understand what you are looking to do. Make sure you are including only eligible expenses. So if there are things that you cannot include in the budget or things that you meant to include but you forgot to put in your initial budget, then don't include those. And you want to make sure that you're creating this cover sheet for the full report as well as each expense category. And here's an example of what those should look like. So this is, for example, the cover sheet that Housing Action Illinois actually uses for its FPP quarterly reporting. We indicate which contract this is, which quarter this is, and what our contract number is. So that way IDA knows that we're submitting the report for FPP4, what report it is, and what our contract number is. And then also the name and address of our organization and our phone number so that it's easy to find us if there is a question. So IDA has created this following report or this following cover sheet, which can be used for the individual categories. And it indicates the documentation to satisfy for personal and salaries. Um, a payroll statement or pay stubs for each person for pay period with the amount being charged to the program. So again, you want to make sure that when you are, if you are charging your personnel expenses, the assumption is that 100% of that IDA's not paying 100% for your employee. So if you have a housing counselor that you are um, um, compensating using FPP funds, and FPP funds are paying 25% of that person's salary during the quarter, then you want to make sure to indicate that only 25% of the person's salary is being paid with FPP funds. What the IDA staff will be doing is when they're going and looking, they're going to look at the payroll journals, or they're going to look at the pay stubs, and they're going to see how much does it total up to and compare it to what you are actually asking for. So if you were to say, for example, ask for $5,000, but the person was only paid $3,000, there's going to be a question to that. Or if a person is paid $5,000, but you are only charging $1,250 to IDA, then you want to make sure that IDA understands that you are only charging IDA $1,250 against FPP. That way, when IDA goes through and they look at it, they'll see, okay, we see what was paid, we see what we're being asked to cover, and you definitely paid those dollars out, and so you can be reimbursed for those funds. So with this cover sheet, that also serves as a reminder for you of everything that you want to make sure that you are including in that individual category. And then here's another example for fringe benefits. So if you are covering health benefits or other fringe, then you want to make sure that you are showing the invoice, that you are clearly indicating the period that this covers. So for example, if you are covering your employee health insurance, most likely you are receiving a bill from your insurer, if it's Blue Cross Blue Shield or Aetna or whoever else. You should be receiving a bill for each month. You want to indicate on that bill, you want to highlight how much is actually being paid for each employee and what the period of time is. That way, when IDA is looking at the invoice and looking at the check, they can clearly see that this health insurance is for the month of September, which would be an eligible expense, and then they can also see how much of it is being billed to FPP. So you want to get into the habit of, for any category that you're using, of making it very clear to IDA, perfectly clear, crystal clear, what you're trying to do, so that they, when they are reading it, can see, okay, I understand this is for the month of September, it's for health insurance, it's for these two employees, this is the amount that was spent, this is the amount that's being asked to be reimbursed. We get that, we can sign off on that. So the clearer you make it for them, the more efficient it is, and the faster they can turn this around. So here's another example of a cover sheet for training and associated expenses. Remember that in this particular grant, no meals or per diems will be paid. So if someone is to go to a training, you can cover the cost of the training, you can cover the travel, but you cannot cover the actual meals, and you cannot provide a per diem using IDA funds. You want to make sure that you are including the bill or the invoice or the receipt required. You want to make sure that you're showing the payment either in the form of a check or a credit card statement. You want to make sure that it's very clear. If you are sending more than one person, let's say that you are sending someone to the Housing Action Illinois conference, you're sending more than one person. If you receive an invoice and that invoice has um, uh, one amount on it, you want to make sure that you're clear that this invoice covers the registration cost for how many employees that you're sending. That way, IDA looks, they understand it was this individual cost per person, this is how many people went, this is the total. It makes it much easier for them to see, to figure it out, and be able to reimburse you. Some additional tips for completing the report. Make sure all the supporting documentation is clear and in order. The more IDA staff has to look to find answers, the less likely IDA will reimburse your agency for the expense. Or they might reimburse you, but it's going to take a lot longer for those dollars to come to you. And being that most of our organizations really depend on these monies showing up in a timely fashion, the better we are at making sure that IDA can clearly read, clearly understand what we're doing and what we're asking for, it'll be much easier. So again, don't assume that IDA will understand your agency's reporting and documentation logic. It might make sense in your organization, but it might not make sense to IDA. So you want to create a system that is clear for your agency and IDA to understand. And you also want to make sure that all of the organizations that, or all of the people in your organization that are working on this are doing it the same way. Because if you introduce any type of variation to it, and one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, it could become quite problematic and it could slow down the process. Don't spend more than your budget allows. If you need to move money, ask IDA for permission to revise your budget. You should be able to tell on a quarterly basis where you are and how you're spending. So you have plenty of time to go back and make that revision. I'm pretty sure that IDA will be comfortable with you making that revision, but they will want you to ask for permission to make that revision as opposed to apologizing for making that revision. So just save yourself some trouble and ask for permission before making a budget revision. Any questions regarding the FPP4 reporting?
No, David, we don't have any questions now. I just also sent an information about the IDA will send out the cover sheets today, and also is requesting send one email per agency as the email that just I write in the chat. It's
Yes.
sppinfo@ida.org.
Yes, yes. Make sure that you send that to FPP. Also, what you want to do, I'm glad that Vivian brought that up, is create one package of information. Don't send multiple emails. Don't send multiple files. Most of you should be able to create, to combine documents using Adobe Reader or Adobe Acrobat to create one package of information. Do that so that it's one package that IDA has. That way they don't have to try and keep track of multiple files, multiple emails. That's the way things get lost. So you want to make sure that you send this information in one clear, legible package that is easy for IDA to receive and understand. And should you have any questions later on, you can certainly email us. You can certainly call us. We will be happy to answer any questions that you have. Going forward, what might end up happening is that if you submit a report, a quarterly report to IDA, and IDA rejects it, they might not give you tips on what you need to do. They just might refer you back to this webinar. So hopefully the information that you received via this webinar has been pretty clear and will help you to submit a good, legible, and clear package.